Hello and welcome to IndustryBroadcast.com's audio article number 33. Audio article number 33 is written by Soren Johnson. Soren hails from Centralia, a picturesque Washington town with a name straight out of any Richard Garriott RPG. He has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in computer science from Stanford University, as well as a soft spot in his heart for any furry four-legged feline creature. He proudly co-designed Civilization 3, as well as doing the coding and AI on the game itself. From there he went on as the project lead and lead designer for Civilization 4. The latest in his long list of mind-blowing credits is working as a designer and programmer on Spore over at EA Maxis. To open the door into the mind of this superstar of the gaming industry, head over to www.designer-notes.com and keep up to date with his latest articles, rants, and random musings. Audio article number 33, 7 Deadly Sins for Strategy Games, written on September 27th, 2008 by Soren Johnson and read aloud on November the 27th, 2008 by Ryan Wienko. Among computer games, the strategy genre is one of the oldest and the proudest, with a strong tradition running from Mule to Civilization to StarCraft and beyond. Nonetheless, certain design mistakes keep being made over and over again. Here are 7 of the most common. Number 1. Too much scripting. Strategy games have a direct lineage from board games, and the fun of playing the latter comes from understanding the rules and the mechanics of the game world, and then making decisions that have consequences within that world. Computerized strategy games allow a single player to experience the same world on his or her own. At some point, however, strategy developers begin to create lengthy, scripted scenarios with the single-player portion of their games. In fact, the recent World in Conflict shipped without a single-player skirmish mode altogether. These scenarios have a peculiar feeling. They use some of the same rules as the core game, while often violating others. The AI takes action depending not on its own development rate or strategic priorities, but on whether the human has hit certain triggers. In many scenarios, in fact, the human cannot even lose, because when defeat approaches, the script will freeze the AI and start pumping in free units for the player. Further, these scenarios are often built around specific objectives to achieve, such as destroying a specific structure or capturing a single point. These artificial environments take decision-making away from the player. Not only is there only one path to victory, but the player's performance along that path may not even matter. Games without interesting decisions get boring quickly. Fortunately, some recently strategy games, such as Sins of a Solar Empire and Armageddon Empires, have returned to open-world random map gameplay, without preset objectives or artificial triggers, and are reminding us of the joy of cohesive and consistent strategy games. Number 2. Too much stuff. The temptation to pile extra units and buildings and whatever else onto an already complete design is strong. Indeed, I have seen many developers describe games as simply a collection of stuff. For example, 18 weapons, 68 monsters, and 29 levels. This approach is wrong-headed. A game design is a collection of interesting decisions, and the stuff in the game is there not just to fill space, but to let you execute those decisions. Games can provide too few options for the player, but more commonly games provide too many. How many is just right? Obviously, there is no magic number, but it is possible to come up with a good rule of thumb for how many different options a player can keep in his or her mind before everything turns to mush. Blizzard uses the number 12 to make sure their RTSs don't get too complex. StarCraft averaged 12 units per side, so did Warcraft 3, not counting the heroes, of course. And you can bet that StarCraft 2 is going to be in that neighborhood as well. In fact, Blizzard has already announced that, for the sequel, they will be removing some of the old units to make room for new ones. Players must be able to mentally track their in-game options at one time, and putting too many choices on the table makes it impossible to understand the possibility space. Number 3. Limited play variety. No matter how good your game is, it's going to get stale after a while. It's unfortunate when a great game doesn't take a few steps necessary so that the player can change the settings to create alternate play experiences. Company of Heroes is an incredibly tactical RTS, a watershed moment for the genre, but the game allows neither Axis versus Axis battles nor matches with more than 2 teams. This design choice fit the fiction of World War II, but it significantly reduced the game's play variety. An example of an RTS that got this right is Age of Empires. Not only could you mix and match any combination of civilizations and players into teams, but you could also design your own map scripts. I remember one interesting Age of Kings map that had almost no wood, but tons of stone and gold, which turned the game's economy upside down. The game even allowed multiple players to control the same single civilization. One could control the military, the other the economy. Thus, I've played 2 versus 3 games of Age of Kings, where the sides with 2 civs actually were controlled by 4 players, and in fact handedly won the game. These simple variations probably double the lifespan of a game such as Age of Kings amongst many of my groups of friends. Significantly, these options should be orthogonal to the game's core mechanics. They need to add variety without adding complexity. Number 4. Black box mechanics. Sometime during the late 1990s, around when Black and White was being developed, the concept of an interfaceless game came into vogue. The idea was that interfaces were holding games back from the larger, more mainstream audience. Ever since then, I have noticed a discernible trend to hide game mechanics from the player. Age of Kings shipped in 1999 with an incredible reference card listing every cost, value, and modifier in the game. For modern RTSs, however, it's unusual if the manual actually contains numbers. I want to emphasize that the answer here is not to bathe the player in complicated mathematics in the name of transparency. Indeed, designers should think that their interfaces as having 2 levels. The first a teaching level and the second a reference level. The teaching level focuses on first-time players who need to know the basics, like how to build a tank and go kill the bad guys. The reference level should answer any questions the player can think about of how the game mechanics work. It is perfectly fine, by the way, to put this info inside of a separate in-game resource, such as the Civilopedia. Rise of Legends implemented an interesting version of this 2 interfaces idea. Most of the pop-up help in the game had an advanced mode that you could unlock by holding down a key, giving you significantly more details about the game's underlying mechanics. Number 5. Locked code and data. Protecting your code and data is a very natural instinct. After all, you may have spent years working on the project, developing unique features, pushing the boundaries of the genre. Giving away the innards of your game is a hard step for many developers, especially executives. Nonetheless, we released the game/AI source code for Civ 4 shortly after shipping, and so far the results have been fantastic. 3 fan-made mods were included in the game's second expansion pack. Derek Paxton's Fall from Heaven, Age of Ice, Gabriel Travato's Rahi and the Fall of Civilization, and Dale Kent's World War II, The Road to War. And so far these scenarios have been heralded as one of Beyond the Sword's strongest features. These mods would have been nowhere near as deep or as compelling, or even possible for that matter, if we had not released our source code. For many PC developers, I'm preaching to the choir, so I'd like to be very clear that the problem is worst among strategy games. For whatever reason, perhaps the lack of a pioneering developer like id Software, strategy developers have been much more closed off to modding than their shooter and RPG brethren. There are exceptions, like Blizzard's fantastic scenario editor in Warcraft 3, but by and large, strategy modders do not have many places to turn for their platforms on which to work, which was one reason we felt compelled to focus on modding for Civ 4. Giving stuff away can feel good, and it should feel smart. Number 6. Anti-piracy paranoia. The damage that piracy does to our industry is impossible to calculate, but also impossible to ignore. Few company heads can be as brave as Starduck's Brad Wardell, who chose to leave out copy protection altogether for the Galactic Civilization series. They encourage paying customers by providing online updates to players with legitimate serial numbers. Having some sort of mechanism to stop casual piracy is a given in the industry, but what is not a given is the hoops companies will make their customers jump through just to be able to actually start the game. The most important question to ask is, will this added security layer actually increase our sales? A good place to be lenient, for example, is with local multiplayer games. In other words, players without the CD can join a multiplayer game hosted by a legitimate copy. StarCraft lets you spawn extra copies of the game that can only join local multiplayer games. Allowing unlimited LAN play was our unofficial policy for Civ 4 as well. The game does a disk check when opening the executable, but not when you actually launch the game. Thus, a group of 4 friends could just pass one disk around for local multiplayer games. We do not believe players are willing to buy extra discs just for LAN parties, which are rare events. However, we would love for new players to be introduced to civilizations in these environments, encouraged by their friends who are already fans. At some point they are going to want to try the single player, and in which case it is time for a trip down to the local retailer to buy their own copy. Number 7. Putting story in the wrong places. Story in games have a checkered history. Too many have suffered from boring cutscenes, stereotyped characters, and plots that take away from the player. Especially problematic are games which don't let the player fast forward through cringe-worthy dialogue. The worst offense, however, is when a story gets stuck somewhere it doesn't really belong. Like in a strategy game. After all, strategy games are the original game. Humans first discovered gameplay with backgammon, chess, and Go. It's a noble tradition. The story in a strategy game is the game itself. Picking a specific example, how much better a game would Rise of Legends have been if big, huge games had given up on creating a story-based campaign and instead iterated on the excellent turn-based Conquer the World strategy layer from Rise of Nations. Ironically, the campaign mode was my favorite way to play ROL. I love that you could acquire technologies and advance units on the strategic map between the missions, which helped to simplify the core RTS game. However, I enjoyed the campaign in spite of the story, not because of it. The key point here is that for the sake of chasing a story, big, huge games missed a big opportunity to match a great core RTS game with a simple, overarching strategy layer that could be infinitely replayable. They are not alone. Almost every other RTS developer seems to be falling into the same trap, and it's time for this trend to stop. That concludes audio article number 33, once again written by Soren Johnson. We recommend that you head over to Soren's blog at www.designer.notes.com. And as always, please check back to industrybroadcast.com frequently, as we do our best to update the site on a regular basis, bringing you the collective insight